We have a long and interesting day ahead of us, and we will begin by an interview format with a person who knows quite a lot about story in organizations. I'm really glad that Shawn Callahan, founder of Anecdote International, is joining us for yet another time at this conference. When Shawn are going to discuss his insights from 22 years in the field. And you are welcome to offer your questions in the chat. I will be glad to redirect them to Shawn during our interview. And together, I hope we can explore a lot about the application of story in organizations, especially in the top management sector. So, Shawn, I just gave you the hosting rights. Please join me on air. Yay! Lovely to see you.
Good to see some fires. Good to see you, Artem.
We've been mentioning you and your work when discussing applications of story to strategy and in actually many more topics. So I'm really glad to see you live. And
terrific.
Really now.
Good to see. Good to see. Yes, well, I'm coming to you from my hotel room in Porto. So I'm here doing some work. So a long way away from my hometown of Melbourne.
Lovely. Have a safe travels and great work out there. And once again, dear participants, they're already saying good morning to you. And please, we welcome your questions in the chat. I will be offering them to Shawn, and let's have a great chat about it. So before we dive into the serious stuff, I would like to know, like, for first warm-up question, there must have been times throughout your career where working with stories with serious business people really brought a smile to your face and even made you laugh. Like, can you tell us about like an episode just as a warm-up?
Yeah, sure. With the work I do, I get told lots of different stories, and some of them, can be quite funny. This story was told to me as someone who was at that time, they were in university, and they had a dog that just loved to dig, out in the backyard. And next door neighbor, and it was like a bull terrier, it was one of the sort of tougher dogs. And next door neighbor had a poodle. And one day they came home and they found that the dog had dug under the fence, and out the back, the poodle had been killed by this dog and blood everywhere. It was terrible, right? And so they didn't know what to do. So they went back and took this poodle and they washed all its fur and got it all clean, and then they took the poodle back over to their neighbor and put it in in sort of the back near the door. And when the neighbors arrived, they could hear this screaming because their dog had died 2 days earlier. And the dog had dug up this poodle, which they'd buried in their backyard. You hear these funny stories. And now you might think this is a totally frivolous, unrelated business story, but it does have some interesting elements to it. Like, for example, I like stories where the listener has to work out a little bit of it themselves. You have to make those connections. And it's a really nice example of that. I think some of the great storytellers are able to do that. So anyway, that's just a funny one that sticks in my mind.
No, that's a way to brighten up the morning and bring the positive vibes. I mean, the story is great, but
I hope I haven't traumatized anyone too much.
Well, those neighbors were surely traumatized by this. Okay, so moving to some more serious stuff. I believe those kinds of stories that we tell quite often, like small anecdotes that really don't have any applications on their own, of course, they bring a lot of stereotypes to the world of story, and that could be one thing that unites the leaders relating to stories. But that's just one thing we discussed throughout 2 days about stories not being serious. I was wondering, what is like one or several things that you really saw similar between the companies you worked with when leaders were trying to apply story or were getting acquainted with this instrument?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just this 2 days in Porto has been an illustration of it. So right at the end of the 2 days, the CEO stood up. It was a global leadership team, and he was sort of thanking everyone in the room. And he got to the storytelling bit, and he said, "Look, I really want to thank you, Shawn, for what you've done. I think we're making great progress, but I have to be totally honest with you. I thought at first this was going to be a bit fluffy and not really businesslike, right? And I've totally changed my mind. I realize this is important for our business." And so one of the things I see is that when you just talk about storytelling, even when you give examples, they don't get it until they've actually done a little bit of it, right? They have to experience it. You've got to get people in the room and see how they react. You know, it's so interesting when you get these people to share their stories, how the audience, how their colleagues react. And that's when the CEO is looking at that going, "Oh, I see how this works," right? So that's definitely something I see quite often. Another thing that I see is that, you know, I'm obviously trying to get them to share real life experiences, right? But they get in organizations, people get so used to talking at a very abstract high level. And so I got to push hard. You know, they'll sort of say, you know, we've had some massive changes in our organization and we've had transformations that haven't gone well. And I say, well, give me an example. Give me one specific example. And it will be hard for them to think of an example, right? Because then they don't think that way. They don't get down to the detail. So it's a muscle you have to build for these people, to help them find, even like the heads of communication, even the people who, you know, should be really immersed in this, struggle with this idea. So there'd be two things that I see quite often.
Thank you. Awesome. And I'm pausing a bit here for the translator to catch up with us. So yeah, I love your take on this introduction. It seems like there is this barrier before trial and after trial. And a question comes to my mind. So I also see this in my work, and what I usually like to do is to have people share a couple of moments which I've never really say that they are stories. And thanks to you've restricted me from saying the word story with your book. Honestly, that was a great advice. So I always prompt with a positive story that goes something like, share a moment when you were really proud about how your employee acted, even though you didn't expect him to do so. And that really breaks the ice and at the same time builds the confidence. That's my favorite way to do it, because you know, investigating pride is awesome and it's really always positive. Are there some ways you like to break this barrier and offer a trial at your courses that you really like using?
Yeah. Well, the exercise I use, which is not too dissimilar to your example, is I'll pair people up and I'll say to them, I say, look, we're going to do this in two parts. The first part, I want you to just explain what you do for a living, right? And you got 60 seconds. Anyway, so they go and tell what they do for a living. Always boring, always no stories, right? And then I say, okay, in the second part, I want you to share a moment where you felt that you made a little bit of a difference at work, that you helped someone out in some way, right? And so they do that. Of course, they tell a story. And then I just say to them, so what did you notice? And they do all the work. You know, they sort of go, well, it was more engaging. It was more interesting. It was so easy to do. You know, they list essentially for you the benefits of storytelling, right? And it works every time. I use that little exercise. One of the things I've learned is you got to make it's easier if you make the job easy for them, I suppose. Like, for example, I just say, oh, just a small thing, something that anyone, you know, that you could do easily. It doesn't have to be a big thing. You know, I just make sure that they don't overthink it, right? Like it could be just And as soon as they do it, they realize they've got lots of little examples like that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So anyway, I think part of it is just also telling them back some of their own stories, right? So that helps as well.
You reminded me of a phrase that I don't remember it in full, but the two parts of it is a professional soft skills trainer has to be lazy and stupid. Lazy so the participants do the work themselves, and stupid so they like explain the material, and you can give it in plain words. But I don't remember. That was the third one. I don't remember exactly, but that's a great way to do it. Like compare and contrast yourselves, and it gives the like the belief that you are already doing it. So after this barrier, you have a comment.
I was just going to say, what is really interesting is that even though you might have started the workshop and you're talking about storytelling and then you say to them, okay, now share what you do at work. What's your job at work? Hardly anyone tells a story, even though you've told them, like you're in a storytelling workshop and you've given them all these reasons and they still don't, because it's not a habit they've got yet, right? So you're trying to build that muscle, trying to build that habit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really important. Habit is the key to result, not the skill itself. Before we move to the habit bit, I was curious, like when leaders realize that story is something that they already have and it affects in a different way than facts, what kind of stories are the C-level teams, in your experience, most often like curious to learn?
Probably the thing they're worried about, right, is that they're worried about long stories, right? They don't like long stories. They feel that this is not going to work in their world. It turns out it probably could work, but that's their first concern. And it was so interesting. Yesterday, I put up a slide and it had a 3-sentence story by Richard Branson. And the story it's a story, I call it a vignette. It's really good for, and it actually uses the clarity story structure that I talk about in my book, right? And it says something along the lines of, in the past, Australia had 9 banks, but then the top 4 banks gobbled up those big ones. And as a result, Australians don't have any choice. So Virgin Money is going to come in and give you choice again, right? So in just 3 sentences. Now, when I showed that, the CEO was smiling from ear to ear because he could see, oh my God, I could tell these stories in such short, pithy moments. And he then turned to his CFO and he said, we've got to do this for blah, blah. Like there was some project, right, that they had. So these small vignettes, I'm a real big believer in vignettes, are sort of like a gateway drug for these senior leaders because they get real worried about too much emotion. They get too worried about long stories. But once they get these small stories, they can then start to expand into other things, right? So that's the sort of approach. And I had a project last year. We were helping a company pitch for was $1 billion business that they were pitching for. And after they won the work, and at the end, we did a bit of feedback on what was the most important things that they learned from the storytelling. And they came back and said the vignettes, they were able to sprinkle them into all sorts of presentations, into conversations. It became their way of conveying talking points, but in a story fashion, as opposed to how they would normally do it, which is a non-story way. Yeah. So awesome. I'm a big believer in that.
So it's not about this deep dive approach where you say something like, well, I felt the rain falling on my cheek. It's about like short to the point structures. A quick question here. I know quite a lot of story practitioners who say that a story works better if it has this details in it. For example, the story of the dog you told in the morning, which it has all the details you can see and feel and visualize. And vignettes are often like eluding these details. Doesn't it like lose the potential of the story, in your opinion, or is it a surprise you have to pay?
No. I'm just sort of saying that these senior executives are frightened of those stories to start with, right? But I agree that they're the best stories, the stories that actually generate emotion, the stories and that comes from visuals and being specific. But you've got to work, I think, with a lot of executives, you've got to work up to that because they don't even think they can do it, right? They think that's for those gifted storyteller people, right? And I'm not one of those. So that's the barrier that you're working on. So if you can give them a little gateway to sort of say, well, work on these little vignettes, and then, oh, by the way, one of the things I'm trying to help this particular group is help them paint a picture of the future, right? And the way I want them to paint a picture of the future is not to generalize the future, but to be able to say, and I have this phrase that I like them to start with, is imagine this, right? So as soon as you say, imagine this, you can create a little, like you can say, imagine this. One of our chefs walk into the kitchen and they do this and they do that and they do that. And it's just a little a little scenario scene. And then at the end to say, and just think about if we did that, say 1,000 times, or maybe 100,000 times, that would be our future, right? And so what happens is you take the specific and you help them expand into what the impact would be, rather than saying, oh, in the future, we're going to be more collaborative and hit our target of, X billion dollars. No one's in, it doesn't feel, you don't get any feeling from that, right? So future, I think the futures is right down what you're sort of saying. And, there's lots of other types of stories to tell, which require you to have the specificity and the imagery, and that generates emotion. Yeah.
Awesome. That's a great example. And I like these small pivots you take to help them navigate the specificity. A question comes to my mind is working with the C-levels is what I always notice. They really have a hard time with specificity because they're very high above in the hierarchy and everything is way too abstract. But one more thing that I really notice is it's hard for C-levels to share the right beginning of a story to make the ending impactful. For example, I had this guy who told a story to his manufacturing leaders, and he wanted them to believe delegating tasks is good. Yeah. So the story he initially told was something like this. When I joined this company, I was given this amount of people, and I hired a chief engineer, I hired an HR, and I delegated the tasks, and everything went well. And it just falls flat because that's just chronology. That doesn't. And it took me 30 minutes of one-to-one coaching to help him say, well, I was first delegating the tasks. I was scared, and then some uncensored words. So, and he was really tough in terms of getting to tell what he began and then trying to navigate to where he is at right now.
Yes,
that's a major thing. What are some other, maybe you see this in your work and I feel that you do, and what are some other things that really, grind the gears of the C-levels?
Yeah, you're right. They do have that problem of not having examples because they've learned a language which is a non-story language. But back in the many years ago, Tom Peters wrote a book called Management by Walking Around. And so I say to these guys, you've got to be out there walking around. The best example of a CEO actually doing this was from an insurance company. And he would have a topic that he was interested in. And I remember that when I was there, the topic he was interested in was to do with judgment. having good judgment, right? And so what he would do is he'd walk around the organization and he would find stories of people having good judgment. So he had found this story in the call center, and he would tell that story for a week, right? And then the next week, he would find a new story about judgment, and he would tell that story for a week in different forums. And then he'd find a new story. So over these different weeks, he would have different stories. And this had a great benefit for him. It had the benefit of finding and telling stories, but it had an additional benefit, is that he was in the business and he felt like a really approachable CEO. They loved him, right? Because he was telling the stories of the people. It looked like, and he did, he started to really understand this business, right? At all sorts of different levels. So I encourage leaders to do that management by walking around and just come up with a theme, might be one of your strategic choices, for example, and then just every week try to find at least one story, and then next week just tell that story for a week whilst trying to find your next story, right? Simple but effective.
Love it. Great. Like this is really applicable, and yet at the same time, those advice are something that anyone can practice, but not a lot of people seem to. What are some things that, in your experience, really stop the people after the training from practicing these kinds of really easy steps, like managing weight, walking around?
Well, one of the things that stops it happening is that, and we've seen this happen. We were doing we're in the academy of one of the big banks here in Australia, and we ran a program for middle level managers, and I happened to bump into one of the middle level managers after the training, and she said, "Oh, Shawn, I went to tell some stories in the organization, in this presentation, and her boss said that's not the way we do it." Right? And she just killed all the stories. So it made us realize way back when that you can't just train the cohort. You've got to work with the people they report to help them understand why you're even using this technique, right? So it doesn't just stop with the people in the training, right? You've got to do this extra work. The other thing we find too is that at first they don't have stories to tell, right? And they struggle to find their own stories, and so I've really changed my way of training over the years, where I really do a lot of work now and just helping them, like you do, helping them find those little stories. Like people say, I don't have a story. I just don't have any stories. And I said, oh, well, what did you do on the weekend? She said, oh, we went down to the river and we got a little puppy. I said, oh, tell me about the puppy. Anyway, they would tell the little story about the puppy, and it was a cute little story. And then I would say to the group, the thing that you got to do to turn any story into a business story is you have to have a point, right? You have to have a business point. And so I then challenged the group to find the business point that the little puppy story could make. And they always find a point, right? And then everyone goes, oh my God, I have stories everywhere, right? And they're thinking too big. They're thinking they need these grand, marvelous stories. When I say, no, you just need these tiny stories, but you gotta be able to work out the point. Now, here's where AI can help you, right? I find, tools like ChatGPT are really good at working out the business point of a story, right? Just type in your story, or you record your story, transcribe it, stick it into ChatGPT and say, what's 2 or 3 business points I can draw from this story? And in an instant, you'll have them. So you now have like an awesome way of taking your own experiences and turning them into, things that people can tell in a business setting. And this can be at any levels. Like I saw a senior leader in a bank. She was given the job of communicating that their budget had been cut, right? And so this is before COVID, and I remember there was lots of people in the room, and she started off by sort of saying, so you all know I'm going through a kitchen renovation at the moment, right? And everyone's kind of nodding. Yeah, we've heard about the kitchen renovation. And she said, when we got our first budget for that and sort of the quote for it, my husband and I and my son, we sat down and we went, oh my God, we can't actually afford all the things that we wanted in this kitchen. And so together we kind of worked it out and we sort of made a way forward. She said, I need your help, just like our kitchen renovation. I need your help. I need you to help me work out what we can do inside the budget that we have. Well, instead of people fighting and moaning about how the budget had been cut, they turned into a group of people going, how can we work this out? Like, it was masterful in terms of the use of storytelling, right? So that's what I mean. These personal stories can play out beautifully inside an organization and make you sound more human as well.
Oh, that is lovely. You totally remind me of this short story about David Epstein, like from Narrative Therapy, where he was working in the hospital and he was invited by a mother to help her son who didn't ingest food. He had to be fed through a tube because psychological problems. And he goes into the room and asks questions. And at some point, turns out that this kid has a puppy at home who just arrived, and he's very excited to meet him, but he was in the hospital. And for the next 60 minutes, he just bombards him with questions about the puppy, like, where will you play? What is his name? Are you gonna have like favorite spots together? Is it your spots or you're like together? And that's it. And the mother comes to David and says, why didn't you ask him about the problem? And he says, well, I figured that that's not what he needed right now. And it turned out like this kid, a couple of days later, he starts like taking in food again. And the mother was like ecstatic, and she says like, how did it work? And he says, well, I didn't talk about the problem. I talk about the preferred story. And one of the students asked, and this is my favorite moment of this story, like, what if there was no puppy at home? To which David replied, there is always a puppy. And I absolutely loved how you phrased it with the puppy example, because there is always a story, because you're like living. And what I would love to share with our audience is a tool that you've created, which for me is a marvelous example of how you can find the stories of your life, is Character Trumps Credentials. I will leave the link in the description.
Yeah, right.
That's a great set of questions, and I've been recommending it like since 2018. So this reflecting on small moments is what it takes. So yeah, that's a great advice. All right. We have one question in the chat, which I believe it links nicely, because we've been talking about like speaking, but there's the other side, the listener. Michelle is asking if you could break listeners' typical needs into several categories, like 5, what they could be, if any.
Yeah. Well, I think the big need is around meaning making, right? You're trying to understand the meaning of what's happening, and for leaders, this is especially if there's a change happening, people have to make sense of that meaning. So that's probably one of the major requirements that the listener is looking for, and so they're connecting it to their own experience, right? So when you share a story, they're testing it first of all via plausibility. Right? Not through fact, not through, a checking, sort of tick boxing or anything like that. They're sort of going, does this sound plausible? Right? And if it sounds plausible, then they go, they listen at another level. And that plausibility is, has similar things happened to me? Or have I heard things that have happened to me? Other people who, and so all of a sudden you're making this test of your stories. And it's why in organizations, it's very useful to actually test stories, right? And the way I would test stories, not in a formal sense, right? But I would share a story in a small group to start with, just to sort of see reaction, what questions people ask. It's amazing how you discover how you need to change your story, because of the questions. People go, yeah, but how did he end up in that doorway? And you go, oh, I forgot to think. I didn't tell you, right? And then you modify the story. And so by the time you're in the town hall, doing the big presentation, you've tested this story. So that's a couple of criteria, I think, that I think about when, from the listeners, from the audience perspective, that they're thinking about meaning, plausibility, and probably the other third element would be, can I put this into action? Can I replicate this? Right. This, from a business perspective, this is very important. I've seen really bad examples, right? Like, for example, I remember seeing a leader come out and he was trying to encourage everyone to save money. And he literally said, look, I have to fill my Maserati up every day, and it's costing me $100 and something, and you could see the whole audience just slump and go, yeah, you've got a Maserati. Well done you, like total deafness in terms of the audience experience, right? Anyway, so yeah, a few thoughts.
I would need not a fiery emoji, but a crying emoji at this point to just press
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
That's painful.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So as for the last bit of this interview, this second part, I would really like to dive deeper into this applying the stories part, because we've been talking quite a lot about telling, but we know that whether you have a chief story officer or you don't, it's not about the telling, it's about implementing it into the system. And what I really loved about your book, in the third part, you are talking about this magic triangle that you reminded me about, like the 3 points you just mentioned. So the three. Would you kindly take us through this triangle of like implementing the story in an organization?
Remind me of the triangle elements.
Of course. If I remember
No,
correctly, those were.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it was.
No, look, I think with these things, there's a couple of things, right? And forgive me if I do get the triangle wrong, but certainly what my experience these days and what I think about, right? The top of the triangle is really like what's the overarching story, like from a strategy perspective, what's the big story that you're telling? And what I discover in organizations, especially with strategies, is that they often don't even have a real clear understanding of what the big choices that they're making, right? And I wrote a big article about this just recently on LinkedIn, actually all over on my website as well. And I just go through, how do you help people find these strategic choices? Because without choices, without people, and when I mean choices, it might be a simple choice like choose growth. That might be the choice. So, if you've got an option, like just say you're looking at a possibility in your organization. One possibility is to sell the business off. Another possibility is to keep it, even though it's not profit making at the moment, but really work hard to make it profit making and grow. Choose growth would tell you you've got to take the second option, right? So you're giving this, and like that's at the high level of business. This is buying and selling businesses. But let's say it's way down into the organization, right? And you're a site manager, and you want to, you're thinking about a new way, a new product that you want to offer the client. As that would encourage you to do that, right? No, I choose growth, right? I'm going to do that because that's what my company's asking me to do. So that's what I mean by a choice, right? It should help you in a trade-off to go, oh, I should do this, not that, right? And if you add that up over millions and millions of decisions, you can come up with 3 or 4 choices that would actually have a phenomenal impact on your business, right? But yeah, a lot of companies don't have these. I remember a big oil company get in contact with me from the Netherlands. You probably guess who it is. And it was the head of strategy and his head of comms. And he said, look, I think we need a strategic story. And I said, oh, fantastic. I said, look, tell me, what's your strategy? And he said, oh, well, it's not really in one document, it's sort of, and I said, no, that's fine. I said, what, and then the comms guy kept saying, oh, but we have a story. We have a story. And I went, oh, great. Tell me the story, And he just rambled for, 5 minutes. No story. And in the middle of his rambling, the poor guy, I felt really sorry for him. The poor guy in the middle of it, the head of strategy said, yeah, it's clear we don't have a story, right? And this is what's happening in these big organizations, is that they have plans, right? They had like 37 initiatives, big, massive initiatives. And they looked at, and so the head of strategy was more or less orchestrating all these initiatives, but he hadn't looked up and sort of said, okay, what are the big moves? What are the big bets? So we end up helping them do that, because without that, you can't tell a story, right? So anyway, that's one of the problems around the strategic choice. I mean, the actual strategy side, the top part of the the triangle. Now, one of the bottom parts of the triangle is you got to. I think I called them success stories in my book, but I call them progress stories now. I was very influenced by a book called The Progress Principle, and someone in the chat might be able to remind me of the Harvard professor who wrote that. But she essentially asked people to keep a diary of the things that happened in their day that they that really struck them, that really stood out for them. And it turned out all the things people wrote about, here we go, the progress principle, well done. The things they wrote about were little stories of progress, right? And she discovered that, Teresa Amabile, that's right. And she found if people hear stories of progress, they get highly motivated, right? And I also have this idea that if you want to change a culture, you have to change the stories that are told, right? So let's say you have this choice, choose growth choice. You want to go and you want to overwhelm the system with so many stories of people making choice, right? Choosing choice. And, or choosing growth, choosing growth. And when you do that, it starts a momentum, it starts to show this progress. So that's the second part. The third part, now I'm just trying to remember what our third part of the triangle is.
You told,
give me a hint.
In the book, it was story skills, but maybe you have a different name.
Skills, yeah, right. Of course, you got to have skills, right? And really that's, and if I think of the key skills, if I was going to pick maybe 3 skills, right? The first skill has to be, you got to be able to find stories, right? And to do that, you need to know the difference between a story versus a non-story, right? Because of this problem we have of everyone saying everything is a story. And that's a problem. You and I know what a story is, but you go into an organization and they just say, oh, we've got this great story. Our story is about resilience and profitability. Well, that's not a story. That's just a line, that's just a tagline. So finding is probably the first one. The second one is what I said before, is working out the point of the story, right? That's what turns it into a business story. And the third thing is to zoom in, make it specific, make it visual. Visual seems to be the big thing. So one of the things I tell my students is that they often leave out where they were, right? So they'll tell a story, but they, take your example of, your manufacturing guy who's talking about delegation. What would make this a really cool little story, a little addition to that story, would be to him to say, look, I remember I was on the manufacturing floor, right? Now, all of a sudden, your mind pictures a manufacturing floor, right? And I was chatting to Jack, and and you start to tell the story in that specific way. It just creates imagery that people fill in, and I think this power of the audience filling in is one of the superpowers of storytelling, right? So yeah, that'd be the three parts of that that triangle.
Awesome. Guys, leave some fires in the chat if that triangle feels like something like you understand and take in. I just want to see the reaction, because for me it was some like the key part of the book, and the like you could be really keen on telling people how to tell it, but if they imply this whole system, that would be great. And an additional material I just wanted to leave in the chat is you have a beautiful story spotting framework, which really shows what is and what isn't a story. I guess it's like still relevant today.
In every session I go through that, yeah. And it's funny, I when we created that, Mark and I, we thought it was just like about story spotting, right? Like this is a story, but the number of people who use it to actually tell a story, I find quite amazing. And it's nearly always one of the frameworks that maybe 10 years later, people still be able to tell us about that, because it just it was a breakthrough moment for them to be able to go, oh, so that's a story, And I'm still amazed today at how many people in business have no idea about storytelling, right? Like it just hasn't even come on their radar. And I'm thinking, wow, I've been talking about this for 25 years, 26 years. And yeah, there are still people who have no idea. So, I sometimes think, oh, everyone must know this now, right? But it's not the case. So you got to start with these real basic things.
Awesome.
And I guess I'll just also say is that, and I know maybe people on the call will also be part of this, and they may not like what I'm going to say, and that is I really have to push hard to get them to get rid of the idea of the hero's journey, right? And just that old, well, not old, but that sort of screenwriting and Hollywood perspective of storytelling just doesn't help businesses, I feel. Now, there'll be people in there say, oh, well, I run lots of hero's journey things, and it makes a big difference. I don't see it translated into how people tell stories in an organization. So I have to, whenever I get the opportunity, I admonish people for their hero's journey work. Terrible, I know. I can't help myself.
No, I totally second that, and I believe it has a place, and it's useful for creating meaningful screen time experience or written experience. But for the short form, it just falls flat, and it's too big, it's too grandiose. And we actually have a speaker in the second half, Jeff Mead, who will be exploring why the metaphor of the hero's journey is obsolete in the world we live in, not in the stories we tell, like the short anecdote. But so right. I'm with you on this one. We have one more question from Michelle, and I guess we'll be wrapping up with the traditional question after that. So, Shawn, quick question. Do your students come from business families or not necessarily so? Interesting choice of words.
Business families. Well, I mean, one of our companies we work for is Mars, which is a family business. But yeah, it's a good question. It's hard for me to say. These executives in large organizations, you get to see glimpses of their backgrounds, but the CEO I'm working with at the moment, massive organization, 400,000 employees. And he told yesterday in a town hall his family story, and his family weren't a business family. It was a sort of a teacher, type family, and so he came up through that. But his mother really instilled in him that you need to make a difference in the world, and that's how he sort of progressed through his life with that idea. But you do make me think about something, Michelle, and that is, I always wonder how natural storytellers come about, right? Now, we've met these people, right? They're sort of mythological figures who these people, they just tell stories like don't need any training, they just tell stories naturally. I believe that they have come from environments where lots of stories are told, right? They might have a family. This is what I'm thinking of. They might have a family that just naturally tells stories. Well, they tell stories. Or maybe they go to church, and in the church, they tell lots of stories, right? Or maybe they're from Ireland and they go to the pub and the crack, they talk about the crack. That's all about storytelling. There's different cultures that, a lot of oral cultures, like I'm doing this work in Africa at the moment. I tell you, those guys just tell stories like crazy, right? That haven't been separated away from those traditional ways of communicating, which we all have, right? We all have that ability. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but there is something interesting there. And so one of the ways in which to teach storytelling, so you've obviously learned a second language, Artem. You've got that down pat. There's a couple of different ways to learn a second language, right? If you ask anyone, you can sort of say, well, you can go to a class and learn a second language. It doesn't work so well, right? But if you just go to the country and immerse yourself in that language, guess what? You will learn the language. Immersion. So if you want to learn storytelling, in addition to the classroom stuff, go and find places where there's lots of stories told, right? And I ran a program once where I said, look, I'm not going to teach you anything, right? We're just going to tell stories. And we had 8 people in this classroom, went over 6 weeks. And it was the most interesting experience. I had to stop myself from being the coach and just get them to tell stories. And then we talked about stories. And guess what? They could tell stories better at the end of the 6 weeks, right? So there's different ways of doing it. And you can immerse yourself by listening to podcasts that tell lots of stories. Just put stories into your diet, right? Have stories around you. And without even thinking about it, you'll become better storytellers.
Awesome.
So anyway,
that's a great wish. That's a great wish. I hope our listeners will take this into their lives, and I will definitely do so. And I'm already thinking about ways to do more of it. Shawn, quick final question. You've applied stories in myriads of ways, but what if there was only one way or one task you could apply stories for in an organization? What task would it be and why?
Good question. What task? I think it's probably around helping people build rapport and connection. I think that's the task that, is ultimately a human factor. It's what organizations run on, is relationships. And the thing is, we don't really know that much about our colleagues, and to be able to hear their stories and have an opportunity, going again back to this experience I've had in the last 2 days, the CEO gave a big town hall. It was about 30 minutes, I suppose. It was probably a few hundred people in the room. Guess what the first question was? Can you tell us a little bit about your family background? That was the first question, right? And he, I think it caught him a little bit off guard. He was sort of went, but then he told lovely series of stories that helped people understand who he was, what he stood for, what was his background, what were his influences. And I bet you anything, they felt closer to him as a result of him telling that. So yeah, rapport and connection. Awesome. That's a great way to use stories.
Shawn, thank you so much. These fires that will be burning right now are for you. I'm extremely grateful you found the time to join us and share your wisdom. Thank you so much. Pleasure. It was really great.
Good. It's always good to see you, Artem. And thanks for putting on this conference. It's fabulous.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.